It is a hot afternoon in June. You walk out to look at your hydrangea, the big one, the one you have babied for years, and your heart just drops. Every leaf is hanging limp. The whole plant looks like it is begging for water. And so you do the kindest thing you know how to do. You reach for the hose. I want to ask you to wait, just for a moment, because that one act of kindness, reaching for the hose on a hot afternoon, is quietly killing more hydrangeas across this country than any frost, any beetle, any disease ever will. Here is the part almost nobody tells you. A hydrangea wilting in the heat of a June afternoon is very often perfectly fine. Leave it be, and it stands right back up on its own by evening. But read that wilt as thirst. Keep pouring water on, day after day, and you drown the very roots you are trying to save. And the cruelest part? A drowning hydrangea and a thirsty one look almost exactly the same. Same droop, same yellow, same sad, sorry slump. Guess wrong, and you lose the plant. By the time we are done today, you will be able to tell the difference in about 10 seconds, with nothing but the finger on your hand. We have 8 mistakes to walk through, 8 things to never do to a hydrangea in June. And number 3, the watering one, is the silent killer. But every single one of these comes back to the same quiet idea. The secret to a hydrangea was never in the bag you bought. It was in the few inches of living soil underneath it. Because June is the hinge the whole summer swings on. It is when the real heat lands, when the big blooms open, and when this plant is at its most fragile, to a loving gardener doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Before we start, do me one small favor. Drop a comment and tell me the state you are gardening in, and your hardiness zone, if you know it. I am not asking just to be friendly. I am asking because where you live changes this advice more than almost any other plant. A gardener up in Zone 5 is coaxing a plant through cool nights. A gardener down in Zone 8 is watching that same plant faint in the afternoon sun. So when I call out your part of the country, lean in. That is the version written for your backyard. Here is the first one, and it is the one that is often already done. You planted your hydrangea out in the open, in the sunniest spot in the yard. Because more sun means more flowers, right? For a lot of plants, yes. For a big leaf hydrangea, it is almost exactly backwards. These plants never grew up in an open field. They came from the shaded floor of the forest, gentle morning light, and shelter from the hard sun of the afternoon. Those big, broad leaves are practically built to give off water. When the hot afternoon sun hits them, they lose moisture faster than their shallow roots can ever pull it up. The edges dry out, turn brown and crisp. That is leaf scorch. And if you garden down south, or out in the mountain west where the afternoon sun is simply punishing, even the so-called sun-loving types will sulk. Lean toward more afternoon shade than you think you need. The old rule is still the best rule. Morning sun, afternoon shade. That gentle light before about 11 in the morning is plenty to fuel the blooms and dry the dew off the leaves. The harsh stuff after midday is what does the damage. Now, your hydrangea is already planted out in the sun. Do you dig it up in this heat? Please do not. Moving a stressed plant in June is its own kind of disaster. Save your back. Just give it some shade for the worst of the afternoon. A shade cloth, or even an old patio umbrella, will do. Lay down 2 to 3 inches of mulch over the roots, like a cool blanket, and plan to move it in the fall, when everything is calmer. The mistake to avoid here is panic. You do not fix a sun problem in a single hot afternoon. You shade it, you mulch it, and you wait for fall. And here is the quiet bonus. Get the spot right, and that daily afternoon faint mostly stops, which means you stop reaching for the hose, which brings us straight to the next mistake. This is the mistake that feels the most like love. You want your hydrangea covered in flowers, so you feed it, generously, all season, the rich blue stuff from the box. And what you get is an enormous, dark green, gorgeous bush, with almost no flowers on it at all. Here is what is happening. The first number on the bag is nitrogen, and nitrogen drives leaves. Flood the plant with it, and it does exactly what you told it to. It pours everything into green growth and forgets the flowers. The folks at the University of Maryland Extension put it plainly. Hydrangeas fed too heavily with high nitrogen fertilizer can actually bloom less, So far, so familiar. But here is the part that catches even a lifelong gardener off guard. The usual fix you will hear is, feed it phosphorus, bone meal, a bloom booster, the high middle number stuff, to force more flowers. And that one is mostly a myth. Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, the urban horticulturist at Washington State University, who has spent years separating garden folklore from what the evidence actually shows, points out that most garden soils already hold plenty of phosphorus. Pouring on more does not buy you more flowers. Flowering is run by the plant's own rhythms and the light it gets, not by how much phosphorus you pile at its feet. And there is a sting in the tail. Too much phosphorus can actually lock up the aluminum your soil needs to turn those blooms blue. So the very thing sold to give you more flowers can quietly cost you your blue. So here is the honest version. Most established hydrangeas, growing in decent ground, barely need feeding at all. A simple handful of compost worked in around the base each spring is usually the whole story. If you do feed, keep it light, keep it balanced, and do it in spring, not in the heat of summer. When it comes to this plant, restraint beats generosity nearly every time. Because, and this is the thread running through the whole video, all that soft, lush, overfed growth is exactly what wilts first and worst when the heat comes. Which lands us on the big one. One honest little note before mistake 3, since it is the one that matters most. If this is useful to you, subscribing is simply the thing that tells the algorithm to keep sending it your way. It is free. It always will be. That is the whole ask. Now, the big one. Let's go back to that hot afternoon from the start. The plant is drooping. It looks thirsty, so you water it. And the next day, and the day after, and it collapses anyway. Here is the biology, and it is the very heart of this channel. Roots do not only drink water, they breathe. Healthy, living soil is full of tiny pockets of air, and the roots pull oxygen right out of them. Keep that soil constantly soggy, and water fills every one of those pockets. The roots can no longer breathe. They begin to suffocate. And in that airless, waterlogged mud, the things that rot move in. They turn firm, white, healthy roots into brown, soft, foul-smelling mush. And here is the trick that fools everyone. A plant with rotting roots cannot drink. So up top, a drowning plant looks exactly like a thirsty one. It yellows, it wilts, even with its feet sitting in wet soil. You see the wilt, you assume thirst, you water again, and you push it further under. So here is the single most important test in this whole video, the one I promised you at the start. It tells you the difference in about 10 seconds, and it costs nothing. First, the finger test. Before you ever reach for the hose, push your finger 2 or 3 inches down into the soil. If it is bone dry down there, water and water deeply. If it is cool, damp, or wet, stop. Walk away. Whatever is wrong, more water is not the answer. Second, the overnight test. A hydrangea that wilts in the afternoon heat but stands back up by evening is just fine. That is the plant coping with the heat, and it recovers on its own once things cool down. But a hydrangea that is still flopped over at dawn, in soil that is wet, that is not thirst. That is drowning. That is root rot, and you are racing the clock. If you suspect rot, the rescue is the opposite of your instinct. Stop watering and let the soil dry. If it is in a pot, slide it out, rinse the roots gently, and with clean scissors trim away every soft brown one, keeping only the firm, pale roots. Then repot in fresh, well-draining soil, in a pot with real drainage holes. In the ground, work to improve the drainage, and never let it sit in a low corner where water pools. And here is the honest truth, no bag will ever print. The only real cure for this is the discipline to check before you water. Every single time. That finger is the best tool you own, and it is the one tool the garden center can never sell you. Now, there is a way I want to hand you all of this, so you never have to hold it all in your head. Let me show you. Everything we are covering today, the finger test, the morning sun rule, the honest year 1 to year 3 of building living soil under these plants, and the short list of what to simply stop doing, I have gathered it onto a single page you can tape inside the shed door, or stick on the fridge. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me. Because mistake 4 is the one that quietly steals a whole year of flowers, and almost everyone makes it with a tidy pair of shears in hand. Have you ever walked out in spring or in fall, decided your hydrangea looked a little shaggy, and given it a nice neat haircut, and then waited all summer for flowers that never came? I want you to hear this first. You did not do anything wrong as a gardener. You just cut at the wrong moment, and the University of Maryland Extension is blunt about it. Pruning at the wrong time is the #1 reason a healthy hydrangea will not bloom. It all comes down to one idea: old wood versus new wood. The old wood types, the classic big leaf mopheads and lace caps, and the oak leaf kinds, grow their stems one year, then set next summer's flower buds on those very same stems by late summer and fall. Those buds sit there quietly all winter, waiting. Cut those stems in fall, in winter, or in spring, and you are slicing off the flowers before they ever open. The new wood types, the panicles, the cone-shaped ones like the popular limelight, and the smooth types like Annabelle, bloom on growth they put out this very season. Those you can prune in late winter, and they forgive you. And the rebloomers, like the endless summer kinds, bloom on both, which makes them the most forgiving of all. So your only job in June, for an old wood plant, is to enjoy the flowers. Leave the shears in the shed. The most you should do is deadhead, snip the faded, spent blooms just below the flower, and clip out any clearly dead, brittle stick. If an old wood plant truly needs shaping, the one safe window is right after it finishes flowering, before about the middle of July, while there is still time to set next year's buds. The mistake is cutting on instinct, in the wrong season, without knowing your type. Keep the plant tag. When in doubt this June, do not cut, just deadhead. Knowing when to keep your hands off the plant, that is a kind of wisdom that only really comes with the years. And speaking of restraint, the next mistake hides inside something you may do every single day. A lot of good-hearted folks give their hydrangeas a light sprinkle every single day, sure they are doing right by them. But a daily surface sprinkle quietly makes the plant weaker. When you only wet the top of the soil, you teach the roots to stay shallow, right up near the surface. And in the June heat, that top layer dries out first and fastest. So a shallow-rooted plant faints the moment you miss a day, completely at the mercy of the weather. We want a hydrangea that is resilient, the way we have learned to be. We want those roots to reach down deep, where the soil stays cool and damp on its own. So water deeply, but less often. Soak the root zone well once or twice a week, rather than a daily splash. Let a slow trickle run at the base of the plant, so the water has time to sink in. Early morning is best. And then, mulch. 2 to 3 inches of wood chips or pine bark over the root zone. Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott's reviews of the research are clear on this. A good layer of organic mulch meaningfully cuts how much water evaporates out of the soil, keeps the roots cool, and feeds the ground as it slowly breaks down. It saves water, it saves you trips with the hose, and it builds a stronger plant underneath. The mistake is mistaking frequency for care. A little every day trains weak, shallow roots. A deep soak now and then trains roots that can look after themselves. Now, there is a watering habit even more common than this one, and it does its damage after the sun goes down. After a long hot day, it feels lovely to stand out at dusk and spray the whole plant down, leaves and all, cooling everything off. But watering over the top of the leaves in the evening is an open invitation to disease. Here is why. Hydrangea leaves are prone to fungal leaf spots. Cercospora is the common one, and there is gray mold, botrytis, on the blooms. The University of Illinois Extension explains that the spores overwinter on old fallen leaves on the ground, and every time water splashes up, from rain or from your hose, it carries those spores onto the healthy leaves above. Do it in the evening, and that water sits on the leaves all night long, with no sun to dry it. That is the perfect nursery for fungus. Before long you will see it. Small spots, brown or purple rimmed, with a pale gray center, starting on the lower leaves and creeping upward. And here is the good news. You do not need an expensive fungicide to stop most of it. You just change the habit. Aim the water low, right at the base of the plant, and keep the leaves and flowers dry. If you must water from above, do it early in the day, so any splash has the whole sunny day to dry off. And rake up the fallen leaves under the plant in autumn, so the spores have nowhere to spend the winter. The mistake is the evening shower. Water on the leaves, all night long. Free to fix. It costs you nothing but the timing. Now the next mistake is not about keeping a hydrangea alive at all. It is about the one bit of magic that drew so many of us to this plant in the first place. Its color. And there is a whole basketful of bad advice out there about it. We all know the trick, the hydrangea that turns from pink to blue or blue to pink depending on the soil. It is one of the small wonders of this plant, but you have probably also heard the old advice. Bury some rusty nails, drop in old tin cans, pour vinegar on the soil to turn it blue. Save your time and save your soil. Those range from useless to genuinely harmful. The vinegar only nudges the soil for a few hours before it washes away, and along the way it can hurt the living things in the ground. And the rusty nails? Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott has looked hard at that one. A rusty nail gives off almost no usable iron or aluminum at all. It is a story, not a solution. To understand what is really going on, you can look to Professor Henry Schreiber, a chemist at the Virginia Military Institute, who laid out the chemistry of hydrangea color in the journal American Scientist. And here is the surprising part. The color is not really about how acidic your soil is at all. The acidity is just the doorman. The real story is aluminum. A hydrangea bloom has a single pigment in it. When the soil is acidic, aluminum in the ground dissolves, becomes free to move, and the roots take it up. Up in the flower, that aluminum locks onto the pigment, and that bond is what turns the bloom that deep, vivid blue. When the soil is alkaline, the aluminum stays locked away in the ground, out of reach, and the flower stays pink. So pink to blue was never really about the acid for its own sake. The acid is just what sets the aluminum free. So if you want blue, you gently lower the soil's acidity and make aluminum available, using ordinary elemental sulfur, or aluminum sulfate from the garden center. If you want pink, you add garden lime to bring the acidity down. But do it by the label. Test your soil first, go slow, and do not overdo it. Too much aluminum sulfate can harm the plant. And be patient. Changing the chemistry of soil takes a full growing season, sometimes more, to really show. Nature keeps her own clock, and there is no rushing this one. The mistake is the kitchen shortcut, the nails, the vinegar, the rush. The real lever is aluminum, and it moves slowly. Which brings us to the very last mistake, and it is one that catches even the most seasoned hands, usually right when they are trying hardest to help. You walk out in June, and the plant looks rough, tired, wilting, a few yellow leaves, and you think, it looks hungry, it must need feeding. It is the most natural thought in the world, and it is exactly the wrong move. Never feed a hydrangea that is wilting, stressed, or bone dry. Here is why. When a plant is dry, its roots are already struggling. A synthetic fertilizer is basically concentrated mineral salt. Add that strong salt to dry soil, and it does something cruel. It pulls what little water is left right out of the roots and back into the soil. That is fertilizer burn. It scorches the roots, and you will see it as brown, crispy leaf edges. Think of it this way. If you had just come in from working in the heat, worn out, parched, you would not want someone setting a heavy, rich meal down in front of you. You would want a cool glass of water and a chair in the shade. The plant is no different. So if your hydrangea looks sick or badly wilted, treat the real problem first. Check the soil. Give it a deep, gentle drink if it is truly dry. Let it find its feet and stand tall again. Only once it is strong and steady should you even think about feeding. And when you do, reach for the gentle, slow stuff. Compost. Well-rotted matter that feeds the soil instead of shocking the roots. It cannot burn, and it builds the ground up for next year. The mistake is feeding out of worry. Water first, feed later, lightly, and only once the plant is well again. Now let me pull all 8 of these together, because they were never really 8 separate rules. They are three quiet disciplines. And once you see them that way, June stops being something to dread. The first is the right home. That is mistakes 1 and 2, morning sun and afternoon shade, and a light hand with the feeding. Get the spot right and feed sparingly, and you head off half of these troubles before they ever start. The second is reading the soil. That is mistakes 3, 5, 6, and 8, the whole watering story, which is the single most important hydrangea skill there is. Check before you water. Soak deep and seldom, low and in the morning, and never, ever mistake an afternoon faint for thirst. The third is knowing your plant. That is mistakes 4 and 7, whether yours blooms on old wood or new wood, and what actually moves its color. Learn those two things, and you stop cutting off your own flowers, and you stop chasing color with kitchen scraps. The right home, reading the soil, knowing your plant. Get those 3 right in June, and the plant hands you back a whole summer of blooms. And notice something about every single fix in this video. The shade cloth, the finger in the soil, the handful of compost, the deep, slow soak, the rake under the plant in autumn. There is a reason you have never seen any of these on a display at the front of the garden center. You cannot bottle a finger test, you cannot patent afternoon shade, and you certainly cannot sell a gardener restraint, season after season. These cost almost nothing, and in an industry built on the next bag, that is the one thing they are never quite allowed to be. Nobody hid this knowledge from you. The market simply had no reason to keep reminding you of it. That drooping hydrangea from the very start of all this, the one with every leaf hanging down in the afternoon heat, the one your hand reached toward the hose for. I had one of those. It stood by the back step of the first house I ever planted a garden at, and I watered it and watered it, the way I thought love was supposed to look. I lost it that first summer. It took me years, and a lot of reading by people far wiser than me, to understand that I had not been saving that plant at all. I had been drowning it with kindness. What finally turned it around for me was not a product. It was learning to kneel down, push a finger into the ground, and listen to what the soil was actually telling me. To feed that ground, instead of fussing over the plant. The hydrangeas came back. They always do, once you stop fighting them. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, the patient kind, the honest kind, the kind that trusts the ground more than the bag, then you already belong here. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, careful way, together. And go on. Before you do anything else today, walk out to your hydrangea and push your finger into the soil. Let the earth tell you what it needs. Happy gardening.